"What's a black man like you doing here?" the officer sneered, stepping from his cruiser as if he'd found a threat. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't care. To them, Elias Monroe, an elderly man in a sharp coat, was just another nobody. Loitering, suspicious, expendable. They cuffed him without cause, mocked him in the squad car, and threw him into a holding cell like garbage. But Elias wasn't just anyone. He was a retired Supreme Court justice, and his one phone call would change everything. Subscribe now, because what happens next will shake the system to its core. They expected him to beg. That's what usually happened. Fear, pleading, maybe a tear or two. That's what Officer Travis Rourke and his partner Mason Kincaid had counted on when they threw Elias Monroe, a poised, elderly black man, into the back of a squad car without so much as checking his ID. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't curse or cry or ask them why. He simply sat there, his coat still immaculate, his hands resting in his lap, his expression unreadable. And that terrified them more than rage ever could, because a quiet man with nothing to lose is dangerous. A quiet man who knows the law better than they ever will? That's something else entirely. They didn't know who he was. Not really. To them, he was just another black man loitering outside the Hamilton, the city's elite glass and steel restaurant known for hosting billionaires, senators, and CEOs. Elias had been waiting patiently for his granddaughter to finish her law school dinner event inside. He didn't like crowds, and he preferred to give her space to shine. He had seen too many rooms where black brilliance was dimmed to make others comfortable. But as he stood there, savoring the quiet of the night, the slight breeze brushing against his polished shoes, the police cruiser had rolled to a stop across the street, its engine humming like a predator waiting for its moment. Rourke had stepped out first, his smirk as arrogant as the night was long. Kincaid followed, hand already on the grip of his baton. "Move along, old man," Rourke said, the words lazily cruel. "Can't have you making the place look bad." Elias had turned slowly, hands in view, posture calm. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter." "That so?" Kincaid had mocked. "Maybe she's in there buying your dinner, huh?" They laughed like it was funny, like he was entertainment, like his presence needed permission. Elias had reached into his coat, slowly, methodically, to retrieve his wallet. That was when Rourke slapped it to the ground like it was trash. The cards and bills scattered across the sidewalk. Kincaid stepped on it. Hard. They arrested him moments later for failing to comply. No rights read, no reason given, just cold steel on his wrists and rough hands that dragged him into the squad car. Claire, his granddaughter, had emerged just in time to scream. "You're making a mistake. That's Justice Elias Monroe. You're arresting a former Supreme Court justice." But they laughed. "Cute story, sweetheart," and drove off. In the holding cell, Elias waited. No pacing, no shaking bars, just that same unbearable calm. That terrified them, because there was something wrong with this picture, and even if they couldn't name it yet, they felt it creeping under their skin. He wasn't playing the role they had written for him. He didn't look broken. He looked patient. "Why so quiet, old man?" Kincaid had sneered through the bars later that night, sipping coffee like it was a joke. "Cat got your tongue?" Rourke leaned beside him, fake sympathy in his voice. "Guess he thinks if he stays calm long enough, we'll let him go. Hate to break it to you. We're the law here." Elias slowly raised his eyes. "Only fools mistake silence for submission," he said, voice like silk over iron. They laughed again, but their smirks weren't quite as wide anymore. Because that phone call had already been made. Elias had used his one call not to phone a lawyer, but to speak directly to Chief Justice Alan Whitmore, a former colleague who owed him everything. "They arrested me outside the Hamilton," Elias said. "Rourke and Kincaid, 17th Precinct." A long pause. Then just 2 words from Whitmore. "Stay there." The line went dead, but the storm had just begun. While the officers cracked jokes and bragged about putting another troublemaker in his place, phones were ringing in Washington. Whitmore called the Attorney General. The Attorney General called the Department of Justice. The DOJ called the White House. And by midnight, Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington, the government's most ruthless civil rights prosecutor, was on a red-eye flight. He didn't come alone. And he wasn't coming for a conversation. When Claire burst into the precinct the next morning, Harrington at her side, the room fell silent. Officers straightened. Eyes darted. The receptionist dropped his pen. "Where is Elias Monroe?" Harrington asked. Not shouted. Asked. But his voice cracked through the room like thunder. "Do you understand what you've done?" Claire added, her voice steel. "You put a former Supreme Court justice in a holding cell without checking his ID. You called him a vagrant. You mocked him. You arrested him." Rourke and Kincaid froze in the hallway. Sloan, the captain, stepped out of his office, confused, until he saw Harrington. His face went pale. "Bring them," Harrington said. And just like that, the game ended. The arrogance melted. The laughter stopped. Rourke's smirk disappeared the moment he saw Elias standing outside his cell, free, calm, and composed. "I told you," Elias said softly. "You were making a mistake." But it wasn't over. The DOJ launched a full investigation. Internal Affairs cracked open the files Rourke and Kincaid thought were buried. 7 complaints of excessive force, 4 missing body cam footages, 2 civil lawsuits. Nothing had stuck, until now. Now everything stuck, now everything burned. In the courtroom, Elias took the stand. "They saw me as a problem," he said. "Not a man, not a citizen, not a grandfather, just a black body in the wrong place." His words echoed. His voice never wavered. "I did not resist. I identified myself. I warned them. But they didn't listen. Because they didn't believe I could be someone who mattered." The jury listened. The world watched. And when the verdict came, guilty on all charges, the silence in the courtroom was thunderous. 10 years in federal prison, no parole, stripped pensions, $150,000 fines donated to civil rights organizations, and careers turned to ash. But that wasn't the end. The 17th Precinct became ground zero for a national reckoning. A third of its officers were fired or resigned. Federal oversight swept in. New leadership was installed. Sloan resigned in disgrace, his name forever tied to failure. Police departments across the country were put on notice. And Elias Monroe? He became more than a retired judge. He became a symbol. He stood before Congress weeks later, delivering testimony that would help craft new national policing standards. Claire sat beside him, now a rising federal prosecutor. Harrington launched wider investigations, riding the wave of momentum Elias had created. "You thought I was nothing," Elias had told Rourke and Kincaid on the day they were sentenced. "But I was the law you broke. And now he was the future they could never touch. If that moved you, subscribe. Because next time we'll tell you what happened when Elias took on the governor. You won't want to miss it." Title: Mistaken Power. They thought he was weak. Elias Monroe, a distinguished black elder, stood silently on the sidewalk outside the Hamilton. A restaurant dripping in marble and elitism, as if he didn't belong. He had endured much in life, but this moment, this quiet pause waiting for his granddaughter, was supposed to be ordinary. Yet even silence could provoke suspicion when worn by black skin in the wrong zip code. When officers Rourke and Kincaid arrived, their smirks already written with assumptions, Elias felt it in his bones. The same bone-deep ache he'd known since the 1960s, the same ache from when his own father was beaten unconscious in Alabama for walking too close to a white woman's car. Rourke didn't ask his name. Kincaid didn't inquire why he was there. They didn't ask because they had already decided. Elias was loitering. Elias was suspicious. Elias was a threat. It didn't matter that his shoes cost more than their monthly salary, or that his presence on that sidewalk was protected by constitutional law. They only saw what they wanted to see. Black, still alone. The wallet he extended was knocked to the ground, the cards scattered like fallen leaves, and then they cuffed him. The steel clamped tight around joints stiffened by arthritis. He stumbled slightly as they shoved him toward the cruiser, catching himself on the edge of the doorframe. The pain in his wrist flared. He hadn't felt pain like this since his surgery last year. They shoved him harder. Elias gritted his teeth. He didn't cry out, but he remembered. He remembered the courtroom battles he'd won, the tears of widows he'd comforted after delivering verdicts in civil rights cases. He remembered swearing to uphold justice, and now he was shackled by men who wouldn't even say his name. Inside the holding cell, the humiliation deepened. The walls were smeared, yellowing under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The bench was cold steel, no cushion, no comfort. They hadn't asked him any questions. No paperwork, no name check, just a shove into confinement, an anonymous black man awaiting fate. Elias placed his hat on the bench beside him, adjusted his coat, and breathed through the pain. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the cold, from the slow, aching weight of knowing that even at his age, even with his record, he was still just a suspect to them. He had not eaten. He had not drunk water. No one offered. He requested his phone call. They rolled their eyes. "You'll get it when I say so," Sergeant O'Malley barked. 3 hours passed. When the call finally came, his fingers struggled against the rotary dial of the outdated wall phone. He called no lawyer. He called Chief Justice Alan Whitmore. "It's Elias," he said quietly. A pause. "Where are you?" came the stunned reply. 17th Precinct. No charges, no identification checked, just a black man presumed guilty. The silence on the other end was weighty, then sharp. "Stay there," Whitmore growled. By then, the damage had already spread through Elias's body like venom. The tight cuffs had bruised his wrist. His blood sugar had dropped dangerously low. He was diabetic, something they hadn't asked, hadn't checked. He'd asked for food. "You'll survive," Rourke had said, laughing. "You've lasted this long, right?" That night, the pain in his chest sharpened. The cell blurred. He leaned forward, hands on his knees, breathing in shallow bursts. Alone, forgotten, discarded. And still, he waited. When Claire finally stormed in with U.S. "Attorney Daniel Harrington!" Her voice cracked through the precinct like a gunshot. She shouted her grandfather's name, demanded they explain how they had arrested a retired Supreme Court justice. Rourke and Kincaid were still sipping their coffee, acting like kings of a kingdom built on silence and unchecked authority. But now the tide shifted. "I want the arresting officers brought here. Now," Harrington ordered. Panic rippled. They scrambled to cover themselves, but it was too late. Elias's name was no longer just a whisper. It was a fuse lit beneath an empire of misconduct. But pain lingered, even when the cuffs were removed, even when he was helped to his feet, even when they offered him water like it could undo the bruises and cold and long hours of humiliation. "I told you," Elias said quietly to Rourke. "You were making a mistake." Rourke's smirk vanished. The DOJ didn't just investigate the arrest. They unearthed an empire. Rourke had a file thick with ignored complaints. Kincaid had used excessive force 9 times, all buried by a captain who thought silence meant stability. Elias watched it unfold from a hospital bed, his body reacting to the ordeal, his blood pressure elevated, his joints inflamed, his chest pain persistent. He missed 2 of his medications. The precinct never asked. The doctors warned him he had narrowly avoided a heart attack. He nodded solemnly. "They almost killed me," he whispered to Claire, "and they don't even know." Weeks later, he returned to testify. Thin, paler, slower, but not broken. He stood in court and recounted every moment with surgical precision. "I told them who I was. They laughed. I handed them my wallet. They stomped on it. I said I was waiting for my granddaughter. They called me a liar." The gallery sat in stunned silence. He continued. "The pain wasn't just the cuffs. It wasn't the cold bench or the hunger or the aching bones. The real pain," he said, eyes locked on the jury, "was being erased, treated like nothing, after everything I've done, everything I've given." Harrington stepped forward. "Did you resist arrest?" "No." "Did they read you your rights?" "No." "Did they check your ID?" "No." The final no hit like a gavel. Rourke and Kincaid were found guilty. Civil rights violations, abuse of power, negligence. 10 years, no parole, fines, dishonor. The weight of it crushed the arrogance from their shoulders. Their names were forever tied to the man they tried to humiliate. But Elias never celebrated. His body still ached. His appetite never fully returned. His sleep remained broken. Injustice had left its mark on his soul, as well as his skin. The DOJ continued their purge. The precinct was gutted. Internal affairs expanded their reach. Elias was invited to Washington to testify on federal police reform. Claire stood beside him. This time he was not alone. As he stood at the Capitol, cameras flashing, his voice firm despite the lingering pain, Elias said, "They tried to disappear me, but I will not be erased. Not by fear, not by arrogance, and not by a badge that forgets who it serves." If this story moved you, subscribe. Because next time you'll see how Elias turned that courtroom victory into a national reform. And what happened when another officer, one far more powerful, tried to silence him again. Stay tuned. Title: The Hand That Still Bleeds. The flashing lights didn't faze him anymore. Elias Monroe, a black man with decades of resilience carved into his bones, had long learned to brace himself whenever red and blue danced across his windshield. But nothing, not his military service, not his law degree, not even the civil rights legislation he had helped draft, could have prepared him for what happened that night on the highway shoulder outside Charleston. One moment, he was pulling over to breathe. Just breathe. A panic attack had gripped him on the way home from a veterans' mental health summit. He didn't want to cause an accident. He just needed a minute. The next moment, he was yanked from his car like a criminal. "Step out of the vehicle now!" barked Officer Brent Halley, his hand already wrapped around his holster, eyes filled with contempt. Behind him stood Deputy Mallory Reese, arms crossed, gaze hard, silent, but fully complicit. Elias raised his hand slowly. "Officer, I'm just trying to—" But they didn't hear him. No one wanted to hear a black man explain. To them, he wasn't a decorated Army major, not the veteran who counseled other black servicemen through PTSD, not the senior policy advisor behind South Carolina's police reform proposal. To them, he was a threat sitting behind the wheel of a Lexus at night. They tore open his door and slammed him to the ground. His shoulder hit the pavement with a sickening crunch. Gravel sliced his cheek. He tried to speak, but Halley screamed louder, "Stop resisting!" He wasn't resisting. He was sobbing. "Why are you doing this?" Elias cried, but the only answer was the cold snap of steel around his wrists. They dragged him like a bag of trash toward the cruiser. In the window's reflection, Elias saw himself, bloodied, broken, shocked. He didn't recognize that man. Not yet. But he'd come to know him intimately. The man who was once praised in Senate hearings now sat on the edge of a squad car bench, gasping through pain and disbelief. At the station, they gave him nothing. No phone call, no water, no inhaler. His breathing grew strained, tight, panicked. When he begged for his inhaler, Halley sneered. "Maybe you shouldn't have mouthed off." He hadn't said a word. The cell smelled of urine. Rats skittered beneath the cot. His wrists throbbed. His shoulder burned. But worse than any of it was the thought that no one knew where he was, that he could die here, in this hole, reduced to just another statistic. But he didn't die, because he was Elias Monroe, and they had just violated every law he had ever sworn to protect. 7 hours later, someone finally ran his ID. There was a pause, because Elias Monroe wasn't just anyone. He was Deputy Director of the State Civil Rights Commission. And the moment the captain walked in and recognized him, his face turned the color of ash. By sunrise, news vans had parked outside the precinct. Reporters swarmed the sidewalk. Hashtags surged online. Justice for Elias, still bleeding. Civil rights assaulted. But Elias? He was curled in a hospital bed, his shoulder dislocated, his lip split, and his soul shattered in places the X-rays couldn't reach. The doctor whispered, "You had a panic-induced asthma episode. If you hadn't held on." Elias nodded, barely hearing it. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about his father, who had marched in Selma. He thought about his niece, who wanted to become a lawyer like him. He thought about how easily it could have been his funeral instead of his story. His father called him the next day. The old man's voice cracked. "I thought things were getting better. I thought you were safe now." Elias couldn't bring himself to say he'd thought so too. The protests began before he left the hospital, but Elias waited to speak. Waited until his body healed just enough for his voice to rise like fire. He stepped before the cameras in a Navy suit with a sling around his arm and steel in his eyes. "They didn't just assault me," he said, his voice steady but raw. "They assaulted the very belief that a black man can serve this state with honor and still expect humanity in return." The backlash came swiftly. Death threats, hate mail, messages that said, "Drop it or else." A rock through his window, a slashed tire. Colleagues fell silent. Whispers followed him at work. Some called him a distraction. a liability, said he should let it go. But Elias didn't. He filed formal charges, held press conferences, sat before the oversight committee with his shoulder still bandaged. "He threw me down like I didn't matter," Elias said, tears wetting his lashes. "He told me I should have known better. And maybe I should have. Maybe I should have known that no title, no resume, no ribbon makes you safe in a black body in America." The room held its breath. Hallie was indicted. Reese resigned. The chief issued a public apology, but Elias pushed for more. He helped pass emergency legislation mandating de-escalation training, psychological screening for all state officers, funding for body cam audits, a civilian-run accountability board with subpoena power. He turned his pain into policy. But at night, in the dark, the panic still came. He would wake in sweats, breath shallow, seeing blue and red light bouncing off concrete. He'd feel the gravel again, smell the sweat, hear Hallie's voice in his dreams, "And you should have known better." And he never said it out loud, but it haunted him. He almost didn't make it. But still he stood. Elias Monroe was not just a name they tried to stain. He became a movement, a mirror, a reminder that no matter how high you climb, the fall always waits when you're black and breathing in America. He speaks now, at colleges, in churches, in courtrooms, and every time, he begins the same way. "I'm not here to relive my trauma. I'm here to remind you that some of us are still bleeding, and we bleed not just from brutality, but from being forgotten after it happens. And in every room, when the applause fades, there's always one voice that whispers, 'Thank you,' because someone needed to speak, and Elias never stopped." If Elias's story moved you, leave a comment to show him he's not alone. Hit that like button to remind the world that justice has a heartbeat. Subscribe for more stories that expose the truth, fight for the voiceless, and shine a light where silence once ruled. Because this isn't just Elias's story. It's ours. And we're not done telling it. Title: The Secret Inside the Badge. He walked into the courtroom like a ghost dragging his own eulogy. Elias Monroe, a former Army intelligence officer turned elite detective, now paraded as a criminal. The charges: aggravated assault, resisting arrest, impersonating a federal agent. The media framed him as a rogue cop, a man who crossed the line, a lone wolf who cracked under pressure. But the truth? The truth was radioactive. And if Elias ever spoke it out loud, it would detonate careers, destroy legacies, and send shockwaves through City Hall, the governor's mansion, and the backrooms of power most people never see. Nobody knew what he had really uncovered. Not even his attorney. Not yet. It began 9 months earlier, when Elias was transferred, more like banished, to the 13th precinct. A department whispered about even in the Army's most secretive corners. Known for its no-tolerance motto, the 13th was run by a man who wore his badge like a throne. Captain Logan Keller, praised in the press, feared by his men. He kept records with a pen in one hand and a silencer in the other. From day one, Elias noticed the patterns. Reports edited post-incident. Body cam footage corrupted. Suspects with injuries, but no explanation. And officers who asked questions? Gone. Reassigned. Silenced. Elias didn't back away. He started collecting. Quietly. Systematically. He wired his locker. Hid an encrypted hard drive inside the lining of his badge. Used Army-level surveillance tools to record every coded phrase whispered in morning briefings. Clean the list. Contain the story. Neutralize the chatter. It started with suspicion. It turned into a nightmare. A real list existed, a blacklist. Whistleblowers, activists, journalists, even low-level civilians who saw too much. They weren't arrested. They were erased. False warrants, phony charges, dead-end detainments that turned fatal during transport. And then, one night, Elias saw his own name added to the list. The hunter had just become the hunted. He stopped going home, rented rooms under aliases, burner phones in his pockets, gun always on his hip. Everyone thought he was losing it. But Elias wasn't paranoid. He was in the crosshairs. Yet he kept going, because there was one name on that list that ripped his soul wide open. Jordan Reyes. 19 years old, college freshman, last seen live streaming police violence, no arrest record, no booking, no trace. The official story: he fled town. Elias had intel. Jordan was last seen in the back seat of a black SUV, accompanied by two of Captain Keller's most loyal officers, Mercer and Doyle. Elias hacked the precinct's internal network, risked everything. He had help, a fellow Army vet, now a digital ghost with fingers faster than firewalls. Together they pulled GPS logs, deleted reports, off-the-record dispatches. What they found? Terrifying. Jordan wasn't the first. There were 6 others. All disappeared. Same pattern. Same time of night. Same routine pickup. But no one ever made it to a cell. Elias printed the evidence, stored it on multiple encrypted flash drives, sealed one in an envelope marked, "If I disappear, open this." He reached out to an internal affairs officer, someone he'd vetted. They set a meeting. She never showed. The next morning, she was found unconscious in her garage. Carbon monoxide. Accidental. But Elias knew better. The noose was tightening. And then came the night that broke it all open. The department launched a staged raid on what they claimed was a child trafficking den. It was supposed to make headlines, boost public trust. But Elias had intelligence. It was a setup. The house had been empty for weeks. Now it was filled with innocent immigrant children being used as human props for a photo op rescue. Elias barged in. Against orders. Body cam on. Voice calm. He shielded the kids, shouted for a stand down. No shots fired. But the next day, he was booked as a suspect. Obstruction. Assault. Tampering with a federal operation. The body cam footage? Gone. The kids? Disappeared. The media? Silent. Now he sat in court, in cuffs, but unbroken. Officers lied under oath. Said he'd snapped. Accused him of mental illness. Said he was violent, unstable, a threat to his brothers in blue. Even his own partner, shaken and sweating, testified against him. But what no one in that courtroom knew, Elias had already made his move. The encrypted badge, the one chained to his side, held everything. The names, the footage, the evidence. And only his fingerprint and voice could unlock it. That's why they didn't kill him. That's why they put him on trial. Because they needed him to break. Instead, he vanished. The day before the final verdict, Elias Monroe disappeared from the holding cell. No record, no transfer. Gone. The official story? Moved for his own protection. But those who knew him? They knew the truth. He escaped. Hours later, an envelope was delivered to a local news station. Inside was a flash drive. A letter. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. But my truth will. The station aired the footage. It showed Elias entering the house, The children huddled, the weapons raised. The moment Officer Doyle whispered, "Take the shot. Make it look like an accident." The world exploded. Justice for Elias. The badge. Is not immunity. Truth in the shadows. The DA dropped all charges. The DOJ opened a full federal investigation. Keller was placed on administrative leave. Mercer and Doyle? Indicted. But Elias was gone. No body. No signal. No trace. Only a voice, in a video he left behind. "If you're watching this, I'm not dead. I'm preparing. There's more. So much more. Keep watching. Don't let them erase the rest." And just like that, he became a myth. Whispers in precincts, flashes on encrypted forums, a man who could bring the whole damn system down. He didn't disappear. He went underground, because the secret inside the badge hadn't been fully cracked, and the mission wasn't finished. If Elias Monroe's story left you breathless, like this video, leave a comment to show him you believe, that you see him, that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Subscribe, because when the next encrypted drop hits, we'll be ready. And the truth? It's still coming. Title: The Power of His Name. At first, they only saw an elderly black man, tall, soft-spoken, wearing a simple gray coat and scuffed brown shoes, standing alone in the lobby of the Houston Police Department. His hands were folded, his back straight. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't threatening, he wasn't crying. He just stood, waiting. And for Officer Carter, the desk sergeant on duty, that was enough to dismiss him. "Sir, if you're here to file a complaint, take a number," Carter said without glancing up from his clipboard. "You can fill out a civilian form. We'll get to it when we can." But Elias Monroe didn't move. He looked at the officer for a long moment. "I've already been processed," he said calmly. There was something in his voice, not volume, but gravity, that made Carter finally look up. Still, he didn't recognize him. Not yet. 3 days earlier, Elias had been thrown against the hood of a police cruiser. No warrant, no warning, no explanation. His walking cane, carved by hand, a gift from his granddaughter, was ripped from him and cracked on the concrete. His left shoulder wrenched back so hard he heard something tear. His chest forced against steel. His breath stolen. The cuffs locked down too tight. The laughter louder than the sirens. "Another one thinks he's above the law," Carter had said that night, cuffing the man he now couldn't recognize in broad daylight. "Always so mouthy." But Elias hadn't spoken a word. He had just stepped out of a courtroom, briefcase in hand, verdict still echoing in his ears, when the patrol car screeched to a stop. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't check for ID. They just grabbed him. Rough, immediate, merciless, as if his very presence was a threat. He remembered the scrape of pavement against his cheek, the cold of the cruiser door, the one officer who flinched when their eyes met, but still said nothing. Inside the holding cell, Elias sat bleeding, his shoulder throbbing, his ribs aching, his throat dry. When he asked to make a phone call, Carter laughed. "You'll get your call when we decide you're not a threat." 7 hours. No charges, no paperwork, no water, just fluorescent lights, muffled chatter, and silence. But Elias Monroe was not just another man. He was the newly appointed director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, personally selected by the governor to lead police reform across the state. He had sat in federal briefings, written legislation, and met with families devastated by officer misconduct. And yet, for those 7 hours, he was invisible. To them, he was just a black man taking up space. And that's why he had come undercover. He had orchestrated a quiet, unannounced field assessment, a strategy known only to two high-ranking officials. He wanted to see the truth of the departments not through memos or media optics, but through experience. And now he had his answer. They hadn't failed the test. They had revealed their truth. The bruises would heal. The shoulder would mend. But Elias Monroe would not let this pass. Because he knew, if he hadn't lived to tell it, no one would have believed it. He thought of his father, jailed in 1963 for asking why his white boss paid him half a wage. He thought of the young men he'd mentored, bright-eyed and hopeful, who believed the law could be better. And he thought of his grandson, who once asked if justice ever apologized. 3 days after his release, Elias returned, but not in a cardigan. This time he wore a navy blue tailored suit, a sling on his shoulder, his badge clipped to his belt. And this time, he didn't come alone. At his side stood 2 DOJ officials, a U.S. attorney, and a state oversight investigator. Behind him, reporters, cameras, flashing lights, microphones. This time, the entire city would know his name. Carter looked up from the desk and froze. His mouth parted. I'm here, Elias said evenly, to file a formal misconduct complaint against this department and against you, Officer Carter. The cameras surged forward. Reporters shouted questions, but Elias didn't flinch. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for exposure. At the press conference hours later, Elias stood at the podium, arm still in a sling. He told the truth. Every humiliating, violent second. And then he said what shook the state. I wasn't treated this way because they didn't know who I was. I was treated this way because they didn't care who I might have been. Because to them, a black man alone on the sidewalk is always a suspect, always a threat, always disposable. The room fell silent. That night, the footage aired on every major news channel. His name. Is Elias trended nationally. Director not suspect. Justice wears plain clothes. And the consequences came quickly. Within 24 hours, Carter was suspended. Within 72 hours, 4 more women and men came forward, people whose complaints had been buried. This time, they were heard. But Elias didn't stop at punishment. He demanded reform. He launched the Citizen Accountability Board, a civilian-led watchdog agency with investigative power. He overhauled arrest procedures. He issued new ID verification protocols. He introduced 24/7 independent body cam monitoring. He reallocated funding for de-escalation training and anti-bias education. But the most powerful moment came exactly 1 week later. He walked back into that same precinct. Not as a broken man, not as a test subject, as a test, as the highest-ranking public safety official in the state. And this time, every officer stood. Carter wasn't there. His badge had been stripped. His name, now at the center of a civil rights lawsuit that would change how officers were disciplined across Texas. Elias stepped into the briefing room. You may not like me, he said. You may resent that I saw you clearly when you thought no one was watching. But make no mistake, change is not a request. It's an order. And it has a name. They listened, because now they knew. And as Elias exited the building, cameras flashing, microphones lowered, a young boy stood at the bottom of the steps, holding a handmade sign. It read, "You stood for us. Now we stand with you." Elias smiled. "What's your name, son?" The boy beamed. "Justice." Elias looked to the sky and whispered, "Then that's what we fight for." If Elias Monroe's story moved you, hit that like button. Leave a comment below to show Elias he is not alone. Let him know his story didn't just make the news. it made an impact. That you believe a man should be respected before he's recognized. That you believe in justice, not just for some, but for all. Subscribe for more stories like Elias's. Because when courage speaks, we must listen. Elias didn't ask to be a symbol, but his name became a movement. Let's make sure that movement never fades. They didn't see Elias Monroe as a hero, not when he bought the single-story house on that pristine, gated cul-de-sac, not when he waved good morning to neighbors who locked eyes with their lawns, and definitely not on the night they accused him, loudly, violently, and without warning, of a crime he never committed. Because to people like Karen and Russell Caldwell, Elias wasn't a decorated veteran. He wasn't the former Army Ranger who had served 4 tours, pulled brothers out of burning convoys, and came home with scars that couldn't be seen. To them, he was just a black man who didn't belong. An outsider. A threat. It started with a knock. No, a bang. Nearly midnight. Elias had just returned from the local VA hospital, where he volunteered mentoring younger vets. He was still in his scrubs. His Army-issued dog tags hung heavy against his chest. He was locking his truck when Karen's voice split the quiet. "We saw you near our backyard. You were trying to break in." Elias turned, stunned. "Ma'am, I live here," he said, pointing to his porch light still glowing behind him. "That's my house." Russell appeared, a baseball bat clenched tight in his fists. "You fit the description," he barked. "What description?" Elias asked, his voice calm, bewildered. But logic didn't matter. Color did. Without warning, Russell swung. The bat cracked hard against Elias's left forearm. Pain shot through him like a bullet. He fell back, gritting his teeth, raising his arms defensively. "Get off my property!" he yelled. But Karen was already dialing 911. "He's attacking us!" she shrieked. "There's a black man with a weapon!" By the time the sirens wailed through the sleepy streets, Elias was sitting on his steps, bleeding, cradling his arm, still in shock. He knew what was coming. The police didn't ask for ID. They didn't knock. They came with their guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them!" Elias knelt, hands raised. "I'm the homeowner," he shouted. "I didn't." But they didn't hear him. Or didn't care. They tackled him face first into the dirt. A knee crushed his back. Zip ties cut into his wrists. Someone spat. "Another one of you thinking you can outsmart the system." He spent the night in a holding cell. At the hospital, doctors confirmed a fractured arm and bruised ribs. But when he was released, there was no apology. Only a court date. The Caldwells had pressed charges. Burglary, assault, resisting arrest. His mugshot made the local news within hours. The headlines twisted the truth. Man caught near luxury home in late-night altercation. Former soldier linked to neighborhood scare. They used an old Army photo, one where he wasn't smiling, cropped just enough to hide his bronze star. Online, the comments poured in, "Should have known better." He scared those poor people. Another thug with PTSD. The hero they cheered on Veterans Day was now the villain in their suburban fairy tale. The VA hospital put him on leave. "Until the legal matter clears," they said. His mailbox was destroyed. Slurs spray-painted across his driveway. The woman across the street, who once cried on his shoulder when her husband passed, now avoided eye contact. But the most painful moment? His 7-year-old nephew tugged at his shirt and asked, "Uncle Eli, are you going to jail?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. But somewhere beneath the grief, the humiliation, the fractured bone, was that same grit that had carried him through dust storms and gunfire. He wasn't going to disappear. He found a lawyer. A young, fearless black attorney named Renee Johnson, a Harvard grad with fire in her eyes and a reputation for exposing injustice. She took one look at the case and said, "They picked the wrong man." She started digging. The Caldwell's security footage? Mysteriously erased. The police body cams? Malfunctioned. But Elias's smart doorbell had captured it all. The false accusation. The attack. His hands raised. The bat. The lie. Renee made it public. The video exploded. In less than 24 hours, it had millions of views. America met Elias Monroe, the veteran they tried to erase. The outrage was swift and loud. Justice. For Elias, veteran. Not a villain. He served. Talk shows invited him. Civil rights groups rallied. News anchors apologized for the original coverage. The DA dropped all charges. But Elias didn't stop there. He filed a civil suit against the Caldwells, the police officers, and the city of Arlington. And the threats came again. His tires were slashed. He received an envelope with nothing but a photo of his house and the words, "Stay silent." He didn't. He spoke at community forums. He told his story at veterans' halls. He testified before a federal civil rights committee in D.C. "I gave everything to this country," he said, eyes wet, voice steady. "And when I came home, they treated me like a criminal for having the wrong skin on the wrong street." The ruling came a year later. Elias Monroe won. The federal judge awarded him a high six-figure settlement. The Caldwells were forced to issue a public apology on national television. The officers involved? Fired. Their pensions? Gone. The police department? Placed under federal review. But for Elias, the most powerful moment wasn't in the courtroom. It happened one quiet morning. He opened his door to find several neighbors, the very same ones who once looked through him, standing on his porch. Some held apology cards, others casseroles. One man, a veteran himself, removed his cap and said, tears in his eyes, "I should have stood up for you. I didn't know how, but I do now." Elias forgave them, not because it was easy, but because the true enemy had never been his neighbors alone. It was the system that told them he was dangerous, that his skin was a warning sign, that his history of service could be ignored in a moment of fear. Today, Elias runs a national nonprofit that defends wrongly accused black veterans. His case is taught in police academies and law schools. He speaks at conferences, at town halls. He sits on a DOJ advisory board on police reform. And every morning, he steps onto his porch and raises the American flag. Outside the same home they tried to arrest him in front of. He never moved. He never backed down. Because this was always his fight. If Elias Monroe's story broke your heart and filled you with fire, like this video, leave a comment to tell Elias he's not alone. That being black, brave, and home should never be a crime. Let him know his courage matters, that his voice matters, that he matters. Hit that like button to support real heroes. Subscribe for more powerful stories like Elias's. Because when we amplify voices like his, we don't just remember the injustice, we make sure it never happens again. Title: The Chief They Tried to Break. The first time Elias Monroe stepped into the Arlington Police Department, he wasn't in uniform. He wore dark slacks, a charcoal overcoat, and carried a clipboard in one hand. No badge, no stars, just quiet purpose and a presence that filled the hallway without a word. No one knew he was there to lead them. Not yet. He had been appointed after a damning state investigation into excessive force, racial profiling, and a culture of silence that infected Arlington PD from the top down. The governor made a bold move, one that sent shockwaves through the department. He appointed Elias Monroe, a black man, a 25-year law enforcement veteran, and the first outsider ever selected as chief of police, to clean house. Elias didn't come to make friends. He came to see the truth for himself. He wanted to observe the department raw, unfiltered. He listened to the language, the tone, the casual arrogance of a room that didn't know it was being watched. He stood by the hallway bulletin board and jotted fake notes while officers passed by, oblivious. "Word is we're getting some affirmative action figurehead," sneered Lieutenant Richard Miller, slouched at his desk. Boots up, his voice carrying through the bullpen. "They're handing out chief badges like participation trophies now," another officer chuckled. Elias said nothing. He watched. He listened. And then he left. The next morning, he returned in full dress uniform, 3 silver stars on his collar, polished shoes, commanding posture. He stepped into the very same bullpen. Silence fell instantly. "I'm Chief Elias Monroe," he said, voice clear and commanding. "As of this morning, I lead this department." Miller's jaw dropped. The chuckles stopped, and the smirks vanished. But the resistance was just beginning. From the start, the pushback was relentless. Paperwork went missing. Briefings were rescheduled without his knowledge. Field orders were ignored. Officers openly questioned his decisions in roll call. Behind his back, they called him soft, political, the DEI chief. He heard it all. But Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he dove headfirst into the rot. He reopened old complaints that had been buried, reviewed body cam footage never submitted, interviewed community members who had long given up on getting answers. What he uncovered was worse than he imagined. A culture of silence, intimidation, and racial discrimination. Officers with multiple misconduct complaints were being promoted. Community members, mostly black and brown, were charged with obstruction for simply asking questions. Elias built his case quietly, collecting names, dates, violations. He knew if he moved too soon, they'd shut him down. Then came the breaking point. An off-the-books raid, poorly planned, poorly executed, left a black teenager in a coma. No warrant, no justification. The internal report was sealed within 24 hours. Elias demanded it reopened. That's when the threats started. Anonymous texts, his office door vandalized with racial slurs, his parking space keyed. Memos he never wrote began circulating. "You don't belong here. Quit before it's too late." He filed complaints. No action was taken. Then came the night he was attacked. It was late. Elias had stayed behind to finish cross-referencing evidence in the sealed raid case. The building was mostly empty. As he stepped into the parking lot, his phone buzzed. A message. "Leave while you can. Next time we won't miss." Before he could process it, a shadow moved behind him. Then came the blow. Sharp, searing pain across his temple as he hit the pavement. His vision blurred. His head throbbed. His ribs screamed. He heard more than one voice. Laughter. Something heavy crashing against his side. His badge was ripped from his chest. Then, silence. He woke up in the hospital. Concussion. Fractured rib. Deep bruising on his back and neck. The doctors called it an assault. Elias called it a warning. But he didn't resign. 2 days later, limping, bruised, and wearing a bandage over his brow, Elias Monroe stood in front of every officer in the department, and stared them down. "You can hurt my body," he said, his voice gravelly but strong. "But you will not kill my resolve. I came here to clean house, and I won't leave until it's done." They didn't clap, but no one looked away. What they didn't know was that Elias had already sent everything, to the mayor, to the DOJ, to the media, the files, the footage, the hidden complaints, the sealed reports. By lunchtime, DOJ officials arrived and began seizing department servers. By nightfall, 5 officers were placed on leave. The following week, 2 indictments were announced, and Lieutenant Miller, arrested, tampering with evidence, orchestrating illegal raids, leading a network of falsified arrests to target black residents. The man who laughed at the idea of Elias ever being chief was now in handcuffs. Elias didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. Justice didn't need fanfare. It needed follow-through. And Elias was just getting started. The reform initiative he launched in Arlington became a national model. Every officer went through retraining. A new civilian oversight committee was created, empowered with subpoena authority and public access. Promotions were paused until every personnel file was reviewed. He spoke at universities, testified before Congress, led panels on public safety and police accountability. He didn't just change policy, he changed perspective. His limp eventually faded. His bruises healed. But the trauma, the sound of laughter as he lay bleeding in that parking lot, never left. Sometimes, at night, he still heard it. The breathless panic, the sting of betrayal. The faces of the men who wore the same uniform he once believed in, the ones who tried to erase him. But every time he remembered, he stood a little straighter, because they wanted him to be afraid, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. Today, Chief Elias Monroe still walks those halls. He looks new recruits in the eye. He speaks to officers who once doubted him with calm authority. The department is quieter now, more alert, less smug, still healing. But it's no longer the same department. Because of him, because he didn't back down, because he chose to lead even when it hurt. And that choice? It changed everything. If Elias Monroe's story moved you, like this video, leave a comment to show Chief Monroe he's not alone. Let him know that standing against hate and corruption, even when it hurts, matters. That his scars weren't for nothing. That his courage made a difference. Tap that like button to show support for real leadership. Subscribe for more stories of bravery, resilience, and the everyday heroes who rise when others try to tear them down. Because Elias didn't just change a precinct. He lit a fire that's still burning, and we won't let it go out. Title: When Truth Stands Tall. There was a time when Elias Monroe could walk into any law enforcement building in Texas and be treated with reverence. He had built his reputation from the ground up. A former civil rights attorney turned state official, known for his integrity, brilliance, and unwavering focus on justice. But the day he walked into that Houston precinct in plain clothes, the very system he had spent his life trying to fix didn't see Elias Monroe. They saw a black man, a nobody. They didn't ask for ID, didn't listen when he tried to explain. Instead, they shoved him against a wall, twisted his wrist until he cried out, and stuffed him into a holding cell like a criminal. No charges, no apology, no humanity. What they didn't know was that the man they tried to humiliate was the newly appointed director of the Texas Department of Public Safety. And the only reason he was in their precinct was to quietly observe the very problems he was now living through. He had come to investigate the culture of policing. Instead, he became its latest victim. That night in the cell, cold, bruised, his lips split and rage surging through his chest, Elias made a promise to himself. This would not end with silence. It would not be swept under the rug like the countless reports he had pored over. He would not be another name swallowed by the system he had once believed he could change from the inside. He would become the reckoning. And he did. The footage from the precinct was released. His bruises were documented. The story of what happened swept through the nation like wildfire. A black man, a top state official, profiled, assaulted, and unlawfully detained. Not in 1965, not in a small rural town, in the heart of Houston, in 2025. But what the officers didn't anticipate, what the precinct didn't expect, was that Elias didn't just want punishment. He wanted reform, and he had the power to make it happen. In the weeks that followed, Elias led the charge. Officer Carter, the man who led the violent arrest, was fired, stripped of his badge, and later charged with civil rights violations. The supervising sergeant was forced into early retirement. The precinct commander resigned publicly in disgrace. A full departmental review began, but that was just the beginning. Elias launched the Independent Civilian Oversight Commission, the first of its kind in Texas history. It gave everyday citizens the legal power to review misconduct claims and hold officers accountable. He mandated implicit bias training statewide, overhauled de-escalation protocols, and required every law enforcement agency to track and publish use-of-force data monthly. He secured funding for new mental health units, expanded trauma-informed policing programs, and restructured how traffic stops and ID checks were handled, ensuring that no citizen would ever be detained without cause the way he had been. And then, standing on the steps of the Capitol, his arm still in a sling, his face still healing, he gave his first public address since the attack. The crowd gathered in total silence. Reporters, students, veterans, teachers, pastors, all stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. Elias spoke quietly, but his words rang like thunder. "I didn't come here to burn down the system. I came here to remind it who it's meant to serve. We cannot call it justice while ignoring the scars it leaves behind." He paused, locking eyes with the cameras. And for every black man who's been told to wait his turn, for every citizen dismissed because their pain didn't fit the right narrative, this moment is yours. This system will see you now. The crowd erupted, not just in applause, but in purpose. Elias Monroe became more than a survivor. He became a symbol. The man who walked into a jail cell walked out with a movement. His story spread to every corner of the country. Police departments reevaluated their practices. Officers resigned or retrained. Cities expanded civilian oversight. Schools discussed his case in social justice classrooms. Documentaries were produced. The hashtag #StandWithElias trended for weeks. But through all the noise, Elias remained focused. He hadn't wanted attention. He wanted truth. And now he had it. Today, Elias walks with quiet pride. Not because he won, but because he endured. He still visits that same Houston precinct, now transformed into a training facility for ethical policing, bringing students, future officers, and policymakers to study it as a case study in reform. The scars didn't disappear, but something far more powerful took root in their place: change. And if there's one lesson Elias Monroe's story teaches us all, it's this: never mistake silence for weakness. Never let anyone define your worth based on what they fear. Never forget that one voice, one truth, and one refusal to be broken can change everything. Sometimes the badge becomes a shield, not for the people, but from accountability. But when truth rises, when courage refuses to be silenced, even the strongest walls of power have to listen. If Elias Monroe's story moved you, don't scroll past. Leave a comment below to let him know you stand with him, that his pain meant something, that you believe in what he's doing, that we all deserve a world where dignity is not decided by skin tone or title. Hit that like button to support his mission. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of strength, justice, and the everyday heroes who rise when others try to tear them down. Because when we amplify stories like Elias Monroe's, we don't just remember what happened. We make sure it never happens again.